How do you feed a family when there's almost nothing to buy? For decades, Soviet citizens relied on a set of classic cheap meals to get by. These recipes tell a story of hardship, community, and incredible creativity. We're going to explore 20 of these dishes, revealing the secrets behind how they made every single scrap of food count. 1. Potato soup. Let's start with the undisputed king of the Soviet garden, the potato. You see, potatoes were more than just a side dish. They were often the entire meal. They were cheap, they were filling, and you could grow them almost anywhere, especially in a small country garden plot known as a dacha. A staggering amount of the vegetables eaten in the Soviet Union, some reports say over half, came from these private plots. So when times were tough and the store shelves were bare, a sack of potatoes was like gold. The most basic way to use them was in a simple potato soup. This wasn't a fancy, creamy bisque. Most of the time it was just potatoes, onions, and carrots boiled in water with a bay leaf and some salt. If you were lucky, you might have a bit of oil or a spoonful of sour cream, known as smetana, to stir in at the end. That little bit of fat made it feel much richer. What many overlooked is that the water the potatoes were boiled in was a key ingredient. The starch from the potatoes would leak out, naturally thickening the broth and making it feel more substantial. It was a simple trick that made a watery soup feel like a real meal. This soup was the ultimate comfort food for a cold Russian winter. It was warm, it filled your belly, and it gave you the energy you needed for a long shift at the factory. But not all things are what they seem. While it sounds plain, the simplicity was the point. It was reliable. You could almost always find the ingredients to make it. This humble soup was a lifesaver. But what happened when you wanted to make a soup with a bit more flavor, using a vegetable that could last all winter long without spoiling? For that, you needed the other champion of the Soviet garden. 2. Cabbage soup, or shchi. If the potato was the king of the Soviet table, then cabbage was definitely the queen. This tough, leafy vegetable was incredibly important. Why? Because you could ferment it. By shredding cabbage, salting it, and packing it into jars or barrels, you could make sauerkraut or kvashenaya kapusta. This stuff would last for months, and the thing nobody tells you is that it was a vital source of vitamin C during the long, dark winters when no fresh vegetables were available. It was a true superfood born of necessity, and the #1 way to use it was in a soup called shchi. Shchi is one of the most ancient and beloved Russian dishes, and it was a staple for the Soviet working class. The most common version was made from sauerkraut, which gave the soup a wonderfully sour and tangy flavor. You'd cook the sauerkraut with potatoes, carrots, and onions in a simple broth. To put it mildly, it was the smell of home for millions. There was nothing better than coming in from the freezing cold to a steaming bowl of sour cabbage soup. A bowl of shchi was often served with a thick slice of black rye bread, which was perfect for dipping. A dollop of sour cream on top would cut through the sourness and add a creamy richness. You see, this soup wasn't just about filling an empty stomach, it was about tradition. It was a taste that connected people to generations of their ancestors who had survived harsh winters on the very same meal. This sour soup could warm you from the inside out, but for pure, raw energy, workers needed something that would stick to their ribs for hours. The next meal was the ultimate fuel, a super grain that became a symbol of the nation. 3. Buckwheat kasha. Forget about rice or quinoa. In the Soviet Union, the undisputed champion of grains was buckwheat. Known as grechka, a dish of boiled buckwheat called kasha was on the dinner table several times a week. Many people are crazy about its nutty, earthy flavor, but its popularity came from something much more practical. Buckwheat is an incredibly hardy and unpretentious plant. It can grow in poor soil where other grains would fail, making it a reliable crop for the vast collective farms. What many overlooked is just how nutritious this stuff is. It's packed with protein and essential minerals, making it a perfect food for people doing hard physical labor. A plate of buckwheat kasha would give you slow-burning energy that lasted for hours. It was the definition of cheap and cheerful. The most common way to eat it was simply boiled with some salt and a big pat of butter melted on top. The butter was a little bit of luxury that made the humble grain feel special. Sometimes it was served with fried onions, which added a bit of sweetness, or maybe some mushrooms that had been foraged from the forest. It was also the standard side dish for almost any meat you might have. You see, the thing nobody tells you is that a meal's success was often measured by how filling it was. A small meat patty, known as a kotleta, on top of a huge pile of kasha, was considered a perfectly balanced and satisfying dinner. Grains were one thing, but people always craved the taste of meat. When you couldn't find or afford it, you had to get creative with the next dish. A clever trick that fooled the taste buds and filled the plate. 4. Carrot cutlets. In an economy of constant shortages, the desire for meat was strong. A real meat patty, or kotleta, was a treat. But what did you do when there was no ground meat to be found? You made a fake one. This is where Soviet kitchen ingenuity really shines. One of the most common mock meat dishes was the carrot cutlet. It sounds strange, but you have to remember, this was about creating the idea of a satisfying meal. To make them, you'd boil and mash carrots until they were soft. Then, you'd mix them with another cheap filler, usually semolina or breadcrumbs, along with a raw egg to bind it all together. You'd form this orange paste into little patties, coat them in more breadcrumbs, and fry them in oil until they were golden brown and crispy on the outside. When served with mashed potatoes or buckwheat kasha, they looked, at a glance, like a real meal. Of course, they didn't taste like meat. They were soft, slightly sweet, and tasted mostly of carrots. But that wasn't the point. What many overlooked is the psychological comfort this provided. It filled the patty-shaped space on the dinner plate. It was warm, it was savory, and it was a lot more interesting than just eating boiled carrots. The crispy fried exterior gave a satisfying texture that made the meal feel more complete. Making fake meat was a clever trick, but what about when you actually had a tiny bit of real meat? The next dish was a masterpiece of stretching a few scraps into a hearty meal for a whole family. 5. Navy-style macaroni, or macaroni po-flotsky. The name of this dish, macaroni po-flotsky, literally means macaroni in the style of the fleet. The story goes that it was a staple food for sailors in the Soviet Navy because it was easy to make in huge quantities, with simple, non-perishable ingredients. It quickly became a favorite dinner for everyone, from factory workers to students, because it was fast, cheap, and incredibly filling. It was the Soviet version of spaghetti bolognese, but way simpler. The dish has only 2 main ingredients: pasta and ground meat, called farsh. The thing nobody tells you is that the ground meat was often of questionable quality and was usually a mix of beef and pork, but it was the most common way meat was sold. You would fry the ground meat with some chopped onions until it was cooked through. Then, you'd simply toss it with boiled pasta. That's it. No fancy tomato sauce, no cheese, no complicated spices. To put it mildly, it was basic. But it was also delicious in its own way. The fat from the meat would coat the pasta, and the onions would add a touch of sweetness. A huge plate of this could feed a hungry worker after a long day. It was a classic one-pot wonder. You see, efficiency was everything. A meal that could be cooked in under 30 minutes using just 2 main ingredients was a massive win for a busy mother trying to feed her family. Pasta was a factory worker's friend, but deep in the countryside, people relied on a different kind of doughy comfort food, a tiny handmade pocket of warmth filled with the cheapest ingredient of all. 6. Potato dumplings, or vareniki. Making dumplings is a labor of love, and it's a tradition found all across Eastern Europe. In the Soviet Union, these half-moon-shaped dumplings, known as vareniki, were a beloved comfort food. While you could fill them with many things, the most common and cheapest filling by far was simple mashed potato. It was a brilliant way to turn a few potatoes into a fun and satisfying meal. The dough was made from the most basic ingredients: flour, water, and salt. You'd roll it out thin, cut it into circles, and then the whole family would gather around the table to fill and pinch the dumplings shut. What many overlooked is that this process was a social event. It was a time to talk, to laugh, and to work together. Many hands made the work light, and you could produce hundreds of vareniki in an afternoon. Once filled, the dumplings were simply boiled in salted water until they floated to the top. The best way to eat them was with a big dollop of sour cream and, if you were lucky, some golden fried onions on top. The soft, doughy wrapper combined with the creamy potato filling was incredibly comforting. You could make a massive batch and freeze them. The thing nobody tells you is that having a bag of frozen homemade vareniki in your freezer was like having money in the bank. It meant you had a quick, hearty meal ready to go at a moment's notice. Stuffing dough was a great way to make a simple ingredient feel special. But the next dish took that idea a step further, wrapping a cheap filling inside another cheap and very common vegetable leaf. 7. Cabbage rolls, or go lubsai. Go lubsai, or cabbage rolls, are another classic example of Soviet resourcefulness. The concept is simple. You take large cabbage leaves, soften them in boiling water, and then use them as a wrapper for a savory filling. This dish was popular all across the country because it used two of the most affordable and available ingredients, cabbage and grains. The filling was usually a mixture of cooked rice or buckwheat and a small amount of fried ground meat and onions. The key word here is small. The grain was the main component of the filling. The meat was just there for a bit of flavor and richness. By mixing a tiny amount of meat with a lot of rice, you could stretch that precious protein to feed many more people. This was a critical survival strategy. Once the rolls were formed, they were packed tightly into a pot and simmered in a thin, tomato-based broth. Cooking them slowly made the cabbage leaves incredibly tender and allowed all the flavors to meld together. What many overlooked is that this was a perfect one-pot meal. You had your vegetable, your grain, and your protein all cooked together. It was a complete and balanced dinner that felt much fancier than its humble ingredients would suggest. It was a way to create a sense of abundance when there was very little. Cabbage was a true lifesaver. But another, far more colorful root vegetable was the star of the most iconic soup of all time, a dish that held a surprising secret. 8. Meatless borscht. When people think of Russian or Ukrainian food, the first thing that comes to mind is almost always borscht. This vibrant, ruby-red soup, made from beets, is famous around the world. It was, without a doubt, a cornerstone of the Soviet diet. Every family had their own recipe, and it was a source of great pride. While a fancy borscht might be loaded with chunks of tender beef, the everyday version eaten by the working class often had a secret. Most of the time, it contained no meat at all. You see, beets, potatoes, cabbage, and carrots were all cheap and readily available root vegetables that could be stored for months. Meat was not. So, the everyday borscht was a vegetarian affair. The deep, earthy sweetness of the beets, combined with the heartiness of the potatoes and the slight tang of the cabbage, created a complex flavor all on its own. The thing nobody tells you is that a good meatless borscht could be just as satisfying as one with meat. The beautiful red color came from the beets, but a key ingredient for balancing the sweetness was a splash of vinegar or a bit of tomato paste, which also helped the soup keep its bright color. It was always served with a generous spoonful of smetana, that classic sour cream, which would swirl into the red broth, creating beautiful pink pattern. It was a work of art in a bowl, a truly wow-factor meal made from the simplest things. Hot soups were the perfect medicine for a brutal winter. But what in the world did people eat when the summer heat became unbearable? The next recipe is a truly bizarre cold soup that sounds like a joke but was a beloved classic. 9. Cold soup, or okroshka. On a sweltering summer day in a stuffy city apartment, the last thing you wanted was a hot bowl of borscht. The solution was okroshka, a traditional cold soup that is, to put it mildly, one of the strangest and most refreshing dishes you can imagine. It was a summertime staple because it required no long cooking and was made from ingredients you likely already had on hand. Here's the basic idea. You take a mix of finely diced, cooked, and raw vegetables. This usually included boiled potatoes, crunchy radishes, fresh cucumbers, and lots of fresh herbs like dill and green onions. You might also add some chopped hard-boiled eggs and pieces of cooked sausage if you had any. But here is the craziest part. You didn't mix this with a normal broth. The liquid base for okroshka was kvass. Kvass is a traditional fermented drink made from black rye bread. It's slightly fizzy, a little bit sour, and a little bit sweet. So you had this crunchy, savory salad of chopped veggies floating in a cold, tangy, fizzy bread drink. It sounds absolutely wild, but on a hot day, it was incredibly good. What many overlooked is that this was the perfect way to use up small amounts of leftovers. A little bit of potato here, a couple of radishes there, and you had the makings of a full meal. It was hydrating, nutritious, and incredibly cheap to make. A cold soup was a summer treat, but for a quick snack that could be eaten on the go, nothing could beat a savory, handheld pie made from the simplest dough imaginable. 10. Small pies, or pirozgi. Pirozhki are small, boat-shaped pies that can be either baked or fried, and they were the quintessential Soviet snack food. You could find them everywhere, sold by street vendors, in train station buffets, and packed in lunchboxes. They were the perfect portable meal for a worker on the go. The dough was usually a simple yeast dough, but sometimes a quicker, more crumbly dough was used. The real magic, however, was in the fillings. You see, you could stuff a pirozhok with almost anything, which made them the perfect vehicle for leftovers or cheap ingredients. The most common fillings were savory. Mashed potatoes with fried onions was a classic, so was stewed cabbage. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you could find them with a filling of ground meat and rice. But not all things are what they seem. Some of the most beloved fillings were things that many people today would find strange. For example, a very popular filling in the springtime was a mix of hard-boiled eggs and chopped green sorrel, a tangy wild green that people would forage for in the countryside. The thing nobody tells you is that foraging for things like mushrooms and wild greens was a normal part of life and a great way to get free, nutritious food. A warm, greasy pirozhok fresh from the frying pan was one of life's simple pleasures. These little pies were great. But sometimes, all you had in the pantry was a jar of something sour and a few root vegetables. The next soup was born from the absolute refusal to waste anything, especially a jar of pickles. 11. Pickle soup or rassolnik. This dish is a testament to the Soviet principle of waste not, want not. Rassolnik is a hearty soup that has a secret ingredient that gives it its unique, tangy flavor: pickles. And not just the pickles themselves. The key ingredient is the sour, salty pickle brine from the jar. In a world where every bit of flavor was precious, throwing away that flavorful liquid was unthinkable. So instead, it became the base for a delicious soup. The foundation of the soup was usually a simple broth with potatoes and carrots. Pearl barley was often added to make it thicker and more filling. Then came the star ingredients: finely chopped dill pickles and a generous splash of the pickle juice. The brine gave the soup a wonderful sourness that was balanced by the earthy barley and potatoes. What many overlooked is that this soup was more than just a clever way to use up pickles. It was considered a classic folk remedy. To put it mildly, it was thought to be the perfect cure after a night of too much vodka. The salty, sour broth was believed to rehydrate the body and settle the stomach. Whether that's true or not, it was a deeply satisfying and warming soup. It took very simple, cheap ingredients that you almost always had in your pantry and turned them into something with a complex and interesting flavor. Pickles could save a soup, but the next dish relied on a different kind of preserved food, a salty fish that was often the cheapest and most reliable source of protein you could find. 12. Herring under a fur coat. This dish has one of the most poetic and bizarre names in all of cooking: herring under a fur coat, or seledka pod shuboy. It's a layered salad that was, and still is, a required dish at any major celebration, especially New Year's Eve. You might think a celebratory dish would be full of expensive ingredients, but not all things are what they seem. This salad is a masterpiece of making cheap, everyday ingredients look like $1,000,000. The base layer is made of finely chopped, salted herring. Herring was an abundant and affordable fish, so it was a common source of protein. Then, the fur coat is built on top in colorful layers. The layers usually consist of cooked, grated potatoes, carrots, and beets, with a thin layer of mayonnaise in between each one. The final layer is always the vibrant purple beets, which completely covers the salad like a coat. When you slice into it, you see the beautiful, distinct layers. It's a true wow factor on the holiday table. The thing nobody tells you is that this dish was brilliant because you could make it with ingredients that were available even in the dead of winter. Root vegetables and preserved fish were pantry staples. The mayonnaise, a relatively cheap industrial product, tied it all together and made it feel rich and decadent. It was a taste of luxury without the high price tag. A fancy layered salad was for special occasions, but on a normal weeknight, a much simpler fish dish, made from something you'd find in a can, was far more likely to be on the menu. 13. Canned fish cutlets. We've talked about mock meat cutlets made from carrots, but what if you wanted a patty with some actual protein in it, but fresh meat or fish was out of the question? The answer came in a small, flat tin can. Canned fish, like sardines, sori, or mackerel, was an incredibly important part of the Soviet food system. It was cheap, it had a long shelf life, and it was a reliable source of protein and calories when other options weren't available. But eating it straight from the can could get a little boring, so a very common meal was to make cutlets, or patties, out of this canned fish. The process was simple. You'd drain the fish and mash it up in a bowl, bones and all. The bones were usually soft enough to be edible and provided extra calcium. Then, you'd mix the mashed fish with a filler to make it go further. This was usually boiled rice, mashed potatoes, or breadcrumbs soaked in milk or water. You'd add a raw egg to bind it, form it into patties, coat them in breadcrumbs, and fry them until golden. To put it mildly, the smell of frying fish cutlets was a common one in Soviet apartment blocks. Served with mashed potatoes and a pickled cucumber, it was a full and satisfying meal. What many overlooked is that this was a nutritionally smart dish, combining protein from the fish with carbohydrates from the filler. Canned fish was a grim but necessary reality. However, there was another meal even more basic, a dish that was literally just one single vegetable, boiled and sprinkled with a bit of green from the garden. 14. Boiled potatoes with dill. Sometimes the simplest things are the best, and sometimes the simplest things are all you have. For millions of Soviet citizens, a plate of boiled new potatoes tossed with butter and a mountain of fresh dill was not just a side dish, it was the main event. This meal was especially popular in the summer, when the first small, tender potatoes were ready to be dug up from the dacha plot. You see, having a dacha, a small piece of land outside the city, was a huge deal. It was a place to escape the cramped apartment, but more importantly, it was a place to grow your own food. These gardens were a vital supplement to the often unreliable state-run grocery stores. In the summer, these gardens would be overflowing with fresh herbs, especially dill. Dill is the unofficial national herb of Russia, and its fresh, grassy flavor is beloved. The meal itself couldn't be simpler. You boil the small potatoes until they are tender, drain them, and while they are still steaming hot, you toss them with a lump of butter, if you have it, and a huge handful of freshly chopped dill. The heat from the potatoes melts the butter and releases the amazing aroma of the dill. Eaten just like that, maybe with a side of soured milk or kefir, it was a perfect summer dinner. It was a celebration of the harvest and a taste of pure, unadulterated freshness. Boiling potatoes was simple and delicious, but what if you wanted something with a little more texture and crunch? The next dish took that same humble potato and transformed it into a crispy golden fried pancake. 15. Potato pancakes, or draniki. Draniki are potato pancakes, a dish especially popular in Belarus and Ukraine, but loved all across the Soviet Union. They were a brilliant way to turn a few potatoes into a hot, crispy, and incredibly satisfying meal. The best part was that you didn't need any fancy equipment to make them. All you needed was a hand grater. You'd grate raw potatoes and an onion into a bowl. The onion is a key ingredient. The thing nobody tells you is that it helps keep the grated potato from turning brown and adds a ton of flavor. You'd then squeeze out as much liquid as you could from the potato and onion mixture. This step is crucial for getting crispy pancakes. After squeezing, you'd mix in an egg and a spoonful of flour to bind everything together, along with some salt. Then you'd spoon the mixture into a hot, oiled pan and flatten it into little pancakes. The sound and smell of draniki sizzling in a pan is pure comfort. You'd fry them on both sides until they were deep golden brown and crispy on the edges, but still soft and tender on the inside. The absolute best and only way to eat them is hot, straight from the pan, with a giant spoonful of cold sour cream on top. The contrast between the hot, crispy pancake and the cool, tangy smetana is what makes this dish so special. It was cheap, filling, and felt like a real treat. Potatoes were the foundation of so many meals. But what about a soup that relied on another humble and incredibly cheap legume, a food that could be stored for years in the pantry? 16. Pea soup. Pea soup, or gorokovy sup, was a classic cafeteria and home-cooked meal. It was the definition of a hearty, working man's dish. The star of the show was dried split peas, which were incredibly cheap and could be bought in bulk and stored for ages. This made them a reliable pantry staple for lean times. The soup was thick, almost like a porridge, and it was famous for being incredibly filling. The peas had to be soaked overnight to soften them up. The next day, you'd cook them for a long time with onions and carrots until the peas started to break down and turn the soup into a thick, creamy puree. What many overlooked is that you didn't need a blender to make this soup creamy. Time and patience did all the work. The long, slow cooking was the secret. Traditionally, the soup gets its signature flavor from a piece of smoked meat, like smoked ribs or bacon. But for an everyday meal, meat was often too expensive. The thing nobody tells you is that you could get that same smoky flavor by using just a tiny scrap of smoked pork fat or by simply frying the onions until they were very well browned. Served with croutons made from stale rye bread, this soup was a powerhouse of nutrition and flavor that could keep you going all day long. Pea soup was a winter classic. But what about when you needed to use up another one of the great Soviet staples? The next soup was made from something you could find growing wild in fields and forests in the spring. 17. Sorrel soup, or green shchi. After a long winter of eating root vegetables and preserved foods, the first signs of spring were a cause for celebration. And one of the first green things to pop out of the ground was sorrel, a leafy green that grows wild in meadows and forests. This plant, which looks a bit like spinach, has an incredibly bright, sour, and lemony flavor. It was a foraged food, which means it was free, and it was the star of a beloved springtime soup called green shichi. This soup was seen as a spring tonic, a way to clean out the system and get some much-needed vitamins after the winter. The base was a simple potato and carrot broth. At the very end of cooking, you'd add a huge bunch of chopped sorrel. You only needed to cook it for a minute or two. The heat would wilt the leaves, and they would release their signature sour flavor into the soup, turning the broth a pale green color. What many overlooked is the traditional way it was served. A hard-boiled egg was chopped or sliced and added to each bowl right before serving. The richness of the egg yolk was the perfect balance for the sourness of the sorrel. And of course, a big dollop of sour cream was essential to add creaminess and tie all the flavors together. This soup was a taste of hope, a sign that winter was finally over. Foraging was a key skill in the spring. But for the rest of the year, people often had to rely on the most basic grains: